the Western European world and the Middle East tends to treat Africa as an afterthought. I do think that is a thing. But also, even something like the Rwandan genocide, I feel like got more attention than this.
Don't idealize him as the one perfect leader, right? So that is the distinction that a lot of people cannot draw, and that's not true just for Pakistan. That is true for any Islamic country. When they want to elect their leader, they are completely ignoring the fact that they are humans too. That's point.
And that Islam would be like the religion of the heart and the mind, and not of the government.
But he was, I think, there's a lot of negativity about Ataturk too, right?
Hush your mouth.
Islam will continue to be triumphant until there have been 12 Khulafa, all of them from Al-Quraysh.
The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever.
This is my brother, my executor, and my successor among you, so listen to him and obey.
My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting.
Whoso obeys me obeys God. Whoever disobeys me disobeys God. Whoever disobeys my commander disobeys me.
The Lord said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession.
Two systems of government, two visions for life on earth. Whichever is true changes everything. This is Christ and Khulafa.
Hey, welcome to Christ and Caliphate. On this podcast, we talk about things happening in the Muslim world from a Christian perspective, and we also talk about timeless principles as they relate to Christianity and Islam. Today, we are talking about the war in Sudan. Specifically, why we're addressing why no one is actually really talking about this. So one thing, if you look up what's actually going on in Sudan, there's been a history of several civil wars really since the formation of the country. But what we're seeing since 2023 is a large-scale civil war. 150,000 people have been killed by this, and about 12 million people have been displaced. 3 million of those are refugees outside of Sudan now. What's your read on the situation, guys?
Well, that is devastating to see, first of all. And I think to grasp the whole situation, we have to look into the history of Sudan a bit. First of all, I'll start with the name. I don't know if it's relevant or irrelevant, but we have to get in an account.
It's interesting, at least.
Yes, interesting. So the word Sudan originally originates from the Arabic word, which was used as Bilad al-Sudan. Right, and the root word is aswad. Aswad is black, so it is termed as the land of black. Right, that is the origin. And then going to civil war, it is not something that started yesterday. It is ongoing process, or it's ongoing thing for I think decades. I think most of the blame I would put on Bashir, the Colonel Bashir, who was the leader or de facto president or whatever for a very long time, about more than 3-4 decades, and that left the country. Because why I am saying this, Sudan gained independence in 1956 from Britishers, right? And after that, there was a military coup in 1969, I guess, right? And then once he came in, Bashir, right? And he introduced a bunch of Islamic laws in the country, right? He wanted to set Sudan on the course of Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic system, Sharia and all that things, right? So that, I think, in 60s and 70s, that was a time where every country, particularly in Europe and America, there was a large-scale progressive things going on. Countries were developing, and what Sudan did is going back reverse, right? And that had an impact on overall culture of the country, right? The presidents was set that, okay, this is the way Islam would be the way, and this is the only way we're going to go by the old ways, and this is going to work eventually. But at the end of the day, it didn't work. And now the reason Sudan is having a civil war is because of the precedents of what the previous leaders have done to Sudan, right? So it didn't pop out of nowhere, right? The civil war was not created out of nowhere. It's a legacy. Sudan has been struggling with this kind of issues for decades. So, but this time it is more kind of devastating. And on top of that, I will address your question when you said why nobody's talking about it. Number one, it's Africa. That is one of the biggest reasons that nobody's talking about it. For some reason, I don't know, we live in a world where their bias plays a big role. We cherry pick things of our own choices. Particularly we hype Israel Palestine so much that we're ready to die and live for it. At the same time, I was reading the report and it says about half of the population of Sudan, have food shortage. They do not have enough food to eat. And nobody cares. Nobody cares. I didn't see any protest in any Muslim country about, or any people sitting together and saying, we got to figure a way out to end this devastation, right? So I think there exists a bias for some reason. I don't know why, but there exists. Yes.
I mean, I would even argue that some of the Muslim countries are making that in neighboring Muslim countries are making things worse
Oh, yeah, definitely.
because they're feeding a side,
Yes.
right? Like there's people sending arms and weapons and money and whatnot to, and some aid, right? But sending aid to a side as opposed to sending aid to, this is for like people on both sides.
I think, sorry, James, before I need to answer this because it's a very important aspect, that whenever any country, not particularly Sudan, is in turmoil, the extra factions outside, doesn't matter, Muslim country, non-Muslim country, they take advantage of situation. For example, there will be people, not necessarily Muslim countries, will be supplying arms and ammunitions and whatnot, but the main players right now in the story is UAE on the one side. It's been alleged that UAE is helping one side, and on the other side Iran is also
both sides.
yeah, so there is that. Sorry, go ahead now.
And Wagner mercenary group from Russia is heavily involved in this as well. And I think there is an element of that. I think there's an element of both the Western European world and the Middle East tends to treat Africa as an afterthought. I do think that is a thing. But also, even something like the Rwandan genocide, I feel like got more attention than this. Like, if you ask the average person on the street, not the average person, but if you ask the average person who's interested in global politics, they'll probably have a better idea of what the Rwandan genocide is than what's going on in Sudan right now. And my theory on this is that no one quite feels their side in this. So, for example, at the core of it, you don't have two vastly different sides. You have two factions within a previous faction that have now split from each other and fighting each other.
And that's interesting that the one group is led by the vice president, the Liberation Army or something like that. That is a paramilitary, right? And there is Sudanese army. So the two groups, for those people who do not know anything about it, so there's two groups fighting: the Sudanese army and the Liberation Army. Kind of that. There's a militia.
RSF. Rapid Strike Force.
Rapid
Strike Force.
Yes.
Right. Again, it's not even an exciting name. It is an exciting name, but it's not like a cause-driven name, right?
Right.
It's like we hit people quickly and we're the armed forces, right? It'd be like a war between
the Navy and Special Forces, right? Like
the Navy versus the Coast Guard.
Yeah, SEALs, right? Or something like that.
So there's not a ton to differentiate the sides here in any way that makes any particular group of people excited about it, because it's Sunni Muslims versus Sunni Muslims,
right?
But even then, it's not like a grassroots religious movement. It's not like there's vast grassroots Muslim Brotherhood jihadi support on either side of this. It's like one side of military dictatorship versus other side of military dictatorship, right?
Yeah, and it's very
From the
hard.
former
From
from former military
Yeah,
dictatorship.
and it's really really hard to pick a side, and say in some situations you have one side doing good and the other side is evil, right? It's very easy to pick sides, but in this case, I mean, will you tend to support Sudanese army, or you will support this rapid force? It's really hard to pick. So then you go back. It's like, okay, why it all started at first place, right? Why in Sudanese people's mind, or people that are elite class or wanted to rule the country, why this is an element that you gonna stick to the government. You want power. Why you want power, right? I want to have an answer from you
Well,
guys.
first of all, there's resources there. There's gold mines. Anywhere where there's gold mines in the world, there's a good chance that there's lithium. And now with the emergence of the very public pull from many world governments to try and get a hold of like rare earth elements, they call them, that you need for electrical components and stuff like that. The reason why there was a Rhodesian um, a revolution there was because there are, current day Zimbabwe, they're all empty now, but there are gold mines, right? Um, the reason why some of these other governments are getting involved is because they're trying to position themselves to be the recipient of whatever's left there. And honestly, I don't think they really care who dies in the process. So, then there's that, right? Like when we're dealing with a lot of these things, we have to keep in mind that it's it's a war, it's an ideologue war being fought by ideologues, right? So the ideologues are like, I'm entrenched in their position and my ideology is the right ideology, and then you have other people lining up to support that ideology. So, the idea of finding peace, particularly when, there was harmony at one point, right? Like between whatever came out. I'm not saying that they're not violent or anything like that, but whatever came out of the Bashir revolution is, you know, for a little while anyway, had, some kind of like agreement, right? On the way things were going to go.
Very short lived.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's honestly really interesting because neither one, the thing that they both agree on is there should be no democracy. Right? Like it should be the military, and it's either my military or your military.
And it's pretty iconic to say that both were saying that the original cause, the removal of Bashir, was that we want to bring democracy to the country.
Right.
It's what they were pitching, but it was never democracy.
We have an old word from the 80s we use. It's called psych.
Yeah.
The other thing with Sudan is it doesn't quite culturally fit into Africa either. Meaning that it's a very distinct culture, both historically and at present. So it was actually sort of, in some ways, very connected to Egyptian culture back in the day. Like Nubia was what it's called.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually pyramids in Sudan.
How was it?
But they're pointier than like we have Egyptian pyramids like this and Sudanese pyramids are like this.
Yeah, it reminds me of a dictator movie.
Yeah, right.
Our pyramids need to be pointier. So it doesn't quite fit into the Arab world, even though it is an Arabic-speaking country, and there's an Arab majority of Arabic speakers in.
That is, I think, in big question that people relate themselves to Arabs. And I think we're going to talk about it some other day, that why so many Muslim countries trace their back,
sure,
to Arabs, and that it is not genetically proven that they are Arabs. So yeah, that's that.
I also want to add that the spread of Islam in like their neighbor is Ethiopia, right? It's not necessarily viewed as a positive thing by Ethiopians. So, and it's coming out of Sudan. So there's like a lot of back and forth of people crossing the border, and when you go to Ethiopia, I mean they think they're like trace their roots back to Christianity and Judaism, right? So there's this force kind of creeping in from outside of the country. And again, Ethiopia has its own problems, right? They're also, in a conflict. Um, and what you're seeing is a lot of like either I'm going to distance myself from this, right? Let them fight it out because whoever's coming out of that, whatever comes through those gates, right, is something that you have to be prepared to fight, either culturally or militarily. So I think, I mean, outside of all of that, like the big picture stuff, we had talked a lot about the thing that people are talking about. It's not necessarily the origins of the conflict or why. They're talking about the things that are happening to the people in the middle of the conflict, right? So, for instance, it's like the rapes, right? Like the starvation. Those are the things that are starting to garner attention, right? So, and I mean, I'm going to tell you, okay, because I grew up in this country. Um, we have actually, since the 80s, been paying attention to that region for a very long time. I mean, Farm Aid in 1985, right, was like end starvation in Ethiopia, and by proxy, um, uh, Sudan. There was like a huge famine there, and we raised a ton of money, right? And then there were other things that happened, along the way in the 90s. That was like it's always kind of been on our radar, but I think there's also like a fatigue, right? There's a fatigue that's happened with, particularly here in America, in dealing with conflicts in other countries. I think that like people are tired of like, military interventions for one, right? They're tired of like, well, 10 years ago, if we saw this, we'd be like, we should send troops there, right? Like somebody should step in and stabilize the situation. And now we're not there yet. We're not there anymore. I don't think that there's a will in America for that right now, from either party, right? I know that a lot of people are like, well, we should keep funding Ukraine or, doing some of these other conflicts. But I would say that the idea of us like stepping in the middle of another person's conflict is not a popular idea. And then from that standpoint, we have a consumer-based news. So if the people aren't interested in being involved, right, then it's not news. And then they have so many other things that they can sit there and, there's like the mainstream, lamestream media, right, that people will say whatever they call it. But the idea is that they're a narrative that they want to get across, and this does not serve their purpose, right?
Like, in some ways, it's almost like Sudan is a bunch of people's like half brother.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not fully part of the Arab world. It's not fully part of Africa, and so everyone's just kind of ignoring it because there's other things going on.
Right.
No one's really paying attention to it, even though the scale of this is just as big, if not bigger, than like any other war going on.
Yeah, and UN declared as one of the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world right now at the present time.
But ask anyone in Gen X, right? Because they've all been like, we've been around this kind of crisis there, political crisis, famine crisis, all of these other things over and over again. And I think that there's just not like this huge, it's kind of like, again, right? Like really it's happening again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so springboarding off the topic of Sudan. Sudan is obviously a Muslim majority country, and there's a ton of instability there. So we have to ask the question, is there a link between Islam and political instability?
Oh, yeah. There is, if not all the links, but there is the major link. It's the backbone of the problem, I would say, if not all the problems, So in my opinion, yes.
So why is that from your point of view?
First, let me just talk about Sudan and comparison. This is a small comparison. South Sudan got an independence by referendum, right? It was 2012, 2013, somewhere around it, right? Look at South Sudan. It's all peaceful. Why? Majority is not Muslim now, right? They are living in peace. Sudan, Egypt, you name it, Libya, except Morocco, because the principle of Morocco is a little different than rest, but Morocco also had that problem. Syria, Pakistan, Bangladesh, you name it, Afghanistan. Now, going back to the problem, because in Muslim mindset, I'm not saying Muslim mindset, in Islamic system, the change has to become from the top. Nobody is ready to change from the ground level by themselves. They're expecting someone to come and rule them righteously and change everything for them. So the element is the element of control, which we talked a lot about it. They believe that a righteous government will come and apply the Islamic rules that will control people, and that's how you're gonna have a very perfect society where everybody will live in peace. And to get to that, you have to go through a bloodshed or whatever it takes, right? To be righteous. Of course, there are external elements. You say the Western influence, and there is this and lobbying and blah blah blah. But they are, I think, the lesser of importance. The main important part here is the instability is directly related to this ideology in Islam, where you take control of the power and then implement the change.
You know what's crazy is on the way here, in preparation of like this, I was doing a little show prep and I pulled up Chat GPT, right? And I started asking Chat GPT like explain to me, what the Bible says about war, right? So it gave me a whole bunch of examples, and then I started getting into like, what does the Old Testament say? What does the New Testament say? What does Islam say? What does the Hadith say, right? And from the outside, right, and asking an AI, of course, right, is always going to be whatever.
Filtered.
Sure, it's always going to be filtered, but it was just like, only fight to defend yourself. I was talking about the Muhammad and the things that Muhammad taught and Hadith and all this other stuff. Like, only fight to defend yourself. Show compassion on your enemies and all this other stuff. And that seems like in great contrast to what you're saying.
No, it's indeed true. Sorry, James, you go ahead and then I'll talk about it, because it's a very important point that we need to be talking about.
I'm going to talk about that a little bit too, because
So I would
seems
say
pertinent.
in classical Islamic sources, there is nothing where people are advocating doing a revolution, taking violent arms against the government, or that's directly advocating Muslim civil wars.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of the key concerns of the Islamic sources as far as it comes to government is the strength and stability of the state, right? It's not as if the Islam is actively advocating for these bloody revolutions, right? But I do think there are certain ideals, there are certain incentives, there are certain hopes baked into sort of the Islamic mindset, where certain people have always played on those things for a desire for power. Because, and like you're saying, right, there's a hope that you're going to have this kind of ideal system brought in by the right leader.
Rightly guided leaders.
The rightly guided leaders. And so if you look into Islamic history, the first fitna, the first like civil war or rebellion in the Muslim world is about what? Uthman is not considered that rightly guided leader anymore, and they believe that he'd betrayed Islam,
Mm-hmm.
and they wanted to put Ali or Zubair or Talha.
Yeah, just the revolution was to remove him from the power. He is not capable of leading Islamic countries or state or whatever that is.
And then it's the exact same thing with the Khawarij. They rebel against Ali and Muawiyah because they think they're both unrighteous leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And when Ali sent out his negotiation with the Khawarij, what they say is, we will not submit to you unless you give us a leader who is like Omar.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ali's man says, there's no one more like Omar than Ali is. And that's kind of what the argument is. It's an argument like over that.
Yeah.
And so this Islam's view of leadership is almost like this kind of like bright light which attracts moths. It's kind of an inadvertent thing. It's not something the system does on purpose.
Yeah, I think there are two sections that I think should be talked about. First of all, how Muslims see a leader being righteous. if you look at human traits as human nature, we are all sinful, right? We have that sin nature. Doesn't matter how righteous you are, how good you are, you will have the element of some things that are not so much righteous, right? Doesn't matter which leader you pick. You pick Imran Khan, you pick Sisi, you pick whatever, right? They're not perfectly righteous. So what Muslim brain is not capable of accepting human nature. They wanted to see, for example, many Pakistani Muslims think Imran Khan is the most righteous leader in the world. And once he come in power, he's all good and he will implement all good things. Completely making him from a human to some shape of God or something, right? So that is problem number one.
As a supporter of Pakistan's military dictatorship, you would say that.
Well, I am against military dictatorship, number one. Army is worse, and I think Imran Khan, just to clear this point.
No. You can go look at our backlog. We did a whole episode on Imran Khan's arrest. Right?
Yeah.
Jeel is an Imran Khan supporter.
Yes, I support him as for the better Pakistan for sure, but I don't idealize him as the one perfect leader, right? So that is the distinction that a lot of people cannot draw, and that's not true just for Pakistan. That is true for any Islamic country. When they want to elect their leader, they are completely ignoring the fact that they are humans too. That's point number one. Point number two, going back to what you said, right? Islam does talk about all those things. But what Muslims are doing is they're wanted to implement a change that there is scripture that supports that, right? There is many factions, but I'm not saying faction. There are many passages, or there are many pages of history, of literature, of scripture that supports their cause. So I think it's just like what you want to pick up on, right? And then you want, on top of that, Muslims want to implement an Islamic rule in their country. The problem, which I can see, is they have not accepted Western democracy as the way forward. So they are the most confused people in this world, right? They do not accept democracy because it's Western. Communism is already not an option there. So they say, okay, Western democracy is not working for us. Let's implement Sharia, Islamic law. Okay, give me one example throughout the history of Islam where Islamic law or Islamic system worked perfectly.
Well, I would argue that anyone who's tied to the histories of those countries would look back on their past and say, well, these were the golden days, right? Like in Turkey, it would be like the Sultanate, like, oh, that's when things were working right,
No.
Right. And then they forget that, after like World War II, it was a revolution, right? Like we're going to kick them all out and we're going to start the country over,
Right.
That's
Yeah.
World War One.
I do think people have a tendency to idealize the past. That now there of course have been some times when the Muslim world was in the ascendancy and would have been the best place to live on earth at times, right?
But does the world doesn't change with the time? So can you adapt? For example, just given United States, we are living in United States. If you want to implement the rules of 1700, can we make a better society? No, we have to adapt and change and implement.
A lot of people would argue with you on that because we are still governed by rules from the 1700s.
But with changes, with ifs and buts,
Sure.
with a lot of things that we incorporated
Tweaks,
because,
right? Like,
tweaks are important.
Well, maybe not tweaks, but there have been major changes.
Major
Yeah.
changes.
So let's give credit where credit is due as well, right? We're not at all saying that every Muslim country is in current chaos. There are exceptions. Now, Turkey would have been on that list of exceptions. It isn't now, but
The catch is, all those countries which doesn't go big on religion. Religion is an actor, state actor, but it's not the major actor. They are prosperous. Number one, UAE is an example of that. Saudi Arabia is on the same course, right? And of course, you can say, oh, they are rich because of the oil, but oil doesn't give you stability.
right. Yeah, Sudan has gold, right?
Yeah, Sudan has gold, but there is instability. So
Yeah.
that's that.
So let's change course here and talk about, from a biblical perspective, how would you go about building a stable Sudan? What would be the ingredients necessary to go there if you're kind of rebuilding the nation from the ground up?
This is going to sound messed up, but there's a couple ways to go about this. You could take the Old Testament route, and you could just tear down all the idols, tear down everything else, and reconsecrate the country to the Lord. That would, be kind of let's just say an extreme step.
That's a Muslim approach, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, they both took it from the same place, right?
Yeah.
So I think the hard part in dealing with all of these things is, setting up a stable country requires stable people, right? You need people who are united in an ideology. So, first of all, to make that happen, you have to teach that ideology. And again, I think part of the problems is we've talked about, like, let's spread democracy in the Middle East, right? And it doesn't take. Well, all of a sudden you're trying to spread Christianity, right, in the Middle East. As a Christian, you would say we need a Western style democracy based on some, core principles of Western style democracy that came from Christianity, right? I don't know if that would work there because that would take generations to do, and I mean, I keep thinking about Afghanistan, right? Like, we tried to do it. Well, whoever we is, but it was tried in Afghanistan and it failed mightily, right?
Yes.
I would say, Iraq's a little bit of a different story because there was at one point a parliamentary system before Saddam. So at least they were able to kind of go back into their own past and point at a moment in time where, they were at least striving for democracy. So I think the advice would be to the people and not necessarily the system. My advice would be, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, I will hear them from heaven. I will, move and I will bless those people. And I think it's hard in the middle of all right, you're being killed, you're being raped, you're being murdered, you're being so in your analogy, is there a clean slate, right? Is there a way to be able to look at this conflict and say, we're starting over, but that has to come from the heart, right? Like
Right.
the heart has to go, these things that we have invested ourselves in have drawn us to this place of death and bloodshed and decades of waste, right? Like, we haven't been plundered necessarily by outside forces as much as we've plundered ourselves, right?
Agreed.
And you need to come to that, that kind of realization. Real change happens when you're at the bottom. It doesn't happen when you're at the top.
Right.
When you're at the bottom, you start to go, what led me here? How did I become this person? How did we wind up here? And then when you start to walk through that process, you start to go, well, I can't stay in this place. If I stay in this place, it's filled with death. It's filled with murder. It's filled with, corruption. You have to find something else to strive towards. So I think my advice would be, take stock of what brought you to that place. I mean, I would do that to anybody. I would do that to an alcoholic. I would do that to a drug addict. I would do that to, a world leader. I would say that to anybody. You have to look at what brought you here to this moment of desperation and be honest about it, right? Like, be honest about it. Move past the idea that there are things that can't be touched, like Islam, right? Like, because we talked about it, it's easy to see from the outside perspective that there are huge instabilities, political instabilities in countries that are more Islamic, right? And you have to kind of, I'm trying to be kind here, right? Because again, it's not all of them, but the more hardline a country is Islamic, the more and more instability. It's not just instability in that country; it's instability in their neighbors. It's global instability. It all leads to a certain place. Like, look at Iran, right? Like, they're hardliners, and the hardliners, they are influencing global conflicts and different things. So, my answer is be honest with what brought you there. Like, hold nothing back, turn everything over and look at how you got to that place. And, what does it look like to move forward?
I think that's excellent advice to the people. If you're a leader in that kind of situation, what Jesus says is, whoever wants to become the greatest among you must first become the servant of all. And that is the path to service. And Jesus defines greatness as being prepared to lay down his life for his people, right? And that is how God defines what a great leader is, that in its essence. And the problem in a place like Sudan is there's going to be no trust in the government whatsoever right now. And you've got to figure out a way to build trust. And the best way to build trust is to be trustworthy.
Yeah, I think there is one other element that is playing a big role in Sudan. There is no unified identity in Sudan, right? They are split between the Arab descent Sudanese and non-Arab. They don't like each other, right? Sudan already split it in two countries already, right? Sudan was it was the biggest country in Africa, and now is Algeria. Uh, but this South Sudan, now look at South Sudan, right? I gave an example previously too, that how their governance work, how they see things, right? So the problem again, the problem on if you want to change that problem, we have to consider that people at the grassroots level have to change how they see their country being led by, right? So that is my take, that people need to be educated, that there should not be a confusion of what type of system they want. And I am not in favor of implementing a hybrid system or bringing a system from outside and implementing in the country, but it has to be unanimous. Everybody agrees whatever they want to implement on themselves.
Yeah. And again, Western democracy is not the only way to get there, but you've got to have certain principles of that.
Right.
So again, I know Saudi Arabia isn't perfect, but one thing they did really well is the Saudi government invested in their people. It paid for all of them almost to go be international students in in different countries.
Right.
And so to the point where I would say the average Saudi, to an extent, trusts the government to have a steady hand on the wheel, at least, right? Not absolutely, not completely by any means, but they trust their leadership to have somewhat of the country's best interests in mind. And the same is true with UAE as well.
Yeah, I think one element, I would say, it's not maybe not related but important to talk about, that many people in the West think that Western system, if implemented in those Muslim countries, will change the country. No, it's completely it's not true. Why I'm saying it's not true? Because of the mindset of those people, right? They believe that the change has to come from the top and someone will come and change that. And they believe in control. They are not ready to be implemented on that particular system where they want to change on the grassroots level. So Saudi Arabia and UAE, the recipe is that they are keeping their people happy, right? They have resources. The day Saudi Arabia go broke, you will see a civil war in Saudi Arabia, right? That's easy as you get. But again, going back to Sudan, I think the national identity is important if you want to build Sudan again. And it has to be, of course, you can borrow Christian principles, right? That if whoever is the leader is whoever is the prime minister. You mentioned what prime minister is.
First servant.
Yes, first servant, right? They have to see them as a servant, not the leader who leads and control things, but see themselves as someone who is the light of change in that country. And I think that will take care. But it's not overnight process. It's not gonna it's not a magic wand you swing and say, hey, now it's changed. It's the mindset that will change, and the generations to come after will see the fruit of it, I think.
Right. I completely agree. If you're the average Sudanese person watching this, my encouragement to you would be the biggest change that's needed in the country is not so much about leadership, it's about cultural renewal.
Right.
It's widespread transformation of hearts and minds. And the good news is you yourself can deal with your heart and mind, right? You can take that to God. You can strive to be the person God commands you to be, which you can't do fully, which is exactly why you need to turn to him and surrender your life to him. And that happens through the person of Jesus. But as you do that, you can have a glorious future with God, no matter what's happening in the country. But gradually, as hearts and minds change, person by person, soul by soul, individual by individual, then you can change the system to benefit people more broadly. And only through those individual transformations of hearts and minds will the country ever really get any better. Otherwise, people can continue to believe that might makes right. They're going to continue to believe that if we just had the right strong man at the top, if only I was that strong man at the top, then all of our problems would be solved.
And power corrupts people.
I mean,
Power does corrupt people.
I think like I'm looking at what happened in Turkey, after like a caliphate that stood for a very long time, and how people responded. They did have like a leader that spearheaded the change. That was Ataturk, right? But it he kind of put forth this idea like there's a separation between our religion and our state, and that Islam would be like the religion of the heart and the mind, and not of the government.
But I think there's a lot of negativity about Ataturk too, right?
Hush your mouth. No. Well,
as an ardent Erdogan supporter,
Yeah.
so the other part that I'm saying is, what he wound up doing was kind of returning power to the people, right? Like he didn't come with this message of yes, and then we'll implement the system and I will stay at the top, right? I mean, he did, stay at the top, but the whole idea was to implement a system where he wouldn't be there, that was going to move forward, and that, people who had been oppressively governed now had a voice, right? People who were oppressively governed had a say in how their country was going to be governed and how it moved forward. And, I'm saying that if that can happen there, it can happen anywhere, right?
Yes and no at the same time.
Well, no. Okay. Well, this is an interesting point. Maybe, we're going to run out of time, but to conclude what I'm saying is that the problem is in Turkey is it didn't stay that way, right? Like ultimate power corrupts ultimately, and over time people just want to gain more power and get more influence and more of everything else, and that's where like the key value is humility, right? Humility coming from a leader, right? To be able to say, you know what, it's not so important that I stay in power, it's that you're in power.
Oh yeah.
Right? It's that you have the freedom that God wants to give you to be able to determine your own destiny so that you can plot a way forward. And, whatever you would say about any leader, like Ataturk or anyone, right? They're going to be imperfect. They're going to have their flaws. And they're also facing things that I would say contextually you and I can't understand. Because we weren't there. We didn't sit in their shoes. We read about it in history books and everything else like that. But we've got a different take on it now with perspective than they had that they didn't have back then. So I think that like it would be, I mean, like the word I want to use is like slang. It would be like a trip to see what would happen if a leader in the Islamic world took that approach,
right,
and was able to successfully implement it.
Yeah, and so here's the thing, and I'll close with this: that there are people, and there have been Muslim leaders from Muslim cultures and who are devout Muslims themselves, who have had this sort of servant leadership kind of attitude.
Sure.
There have been people like that in history. But the problem is they're working against the center of gravity in the current Muslim psyche.
Right.
Which is what we were talking about at the beginning of this segment, is this desire for a righteous leader who is going to be strong and kind of fix everyone's problems. While everyone wants that, democracy, decentralization isn't sustainable. And that's kind of what was starting to happen in the West as well.
Sure.
That we're getting sick of decentralized and we want
Well,
a Messiah.
decentralism turned into globalism, and then I think that's when everybody was like, "This is starting to get ridiculous." You have like elites telling me what to do, and who's going to save me from that?
Right. When
Right.
people are looking for a strong man again.
Yeah.
And I would close this episode by saying, do not fall for it. There is only one king of the earth. There is only one Messiah, and his name is Jesus. Guys, thank you for listening to Christ and Caliphate. We will be back next time.